it's Kate and welcome to Marvelous Videos. Today we look at A Nightmare on Elm Street, the movie franchise explained. There was a time when slasher villains would wait in a camp by the lake to hunt their new victims, but that changed when the man of your dreams, or rather nightmares, began killing teenagers in their dreams, in the town of Springwood. Freddy Krueger is a slasher villain like no other, as he has the magical ability to appear in someone's dreams, and if they get hurt in their dreams, they also get hurt in real life. In 1984, Wes Craven redefined the horror genre with A Nightmare on Elm Street, and not for the last time. At the time, he didn't expect the film to turn into one of the greatest slasher franchises, and he was surprised when the sequel grossed more than the original. Over time, Freddy changed into a Bugs Bunny-ish character, as the sequels took a detour to horror comedy, but he returned as the sinister killer we know in Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Today, we will look back at all the films in the franchise, including the 2010 remake. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you, and let's begin.
This is God.
Don't Fall Asleep, A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. Wouldn't it be terrifying if the injuries from your nightmares don't disappear when you wake up? Tina Gray has a nightmare where she is getting chased by a burned figure, with knives sticking out of his glove. She wakes up the moment she is attacked, but there are slash marks on her nightgown at the exact spot where she is attacked by the burned figure. Surprisingly, she wasn't the only one who didn't sleep well last night. Nancy too had a nightmare. When the duo discuss their experiences later that night, Nancy realizes that she saw the same figure in her nightmare. As Tina's mother was out of town that night, their friends Glenn and Rod come over to party and have a good time. But when Rod and Nancy fall asleep, the burned figure slashes Tina with his blades in the nightmare, and Rod watches in horror as the injuries show up on Tina outside the dream world. As Rod was the only person present in the room with Tina at the time of her death, the police suspect and arrest him for her murder. Nancy visits Rod as her nightmares continue, and she learns that all of them are being stalked in their dreams by the same figure. She decides to learn more about him after falling asleep. Meanwhile, her friends continue to die outside the dream world once they have been killed in their nightmares. When she manages to bring the burned figure's hat outside the nightmare, her mother recognizes the culprit as a dangerous man from the past. Freddy Krueger was a child murderer, and when he was released from prison, the parents of the murdered children burned him alive, as the law had let them down, and now he was back and has somehow gained the ability to manipulate dreams. Freddy Krueger redefined the slasher genre, as he stalked and killed children in their dreams, instead of waiting for them to show up at a camp in the woods. A Nightmare on Elm Street had become so successful that it practically saved New Line Cinema from bankruptcy. Los Angeles Times had covered a series of articles over 3 years about the mysterious deaths of Southeast Asian refugees who died because of nightmares. One of them refused to fall asleep after a nightmare, but after a while the exhaustion got to him and he succumbed to sleep, only to wake up screaming and stop breathing the next moment. He was a young man in perfect health, and the autopsy revealed that he didn't die of a heart attack. The curious case of his death intrigued Wes Craven, so much so that it became the inspiration for A Nightmare on Elm Street. None of the other installments of the franchise were as terrifying as the first one. Perhaps it's Freddy's silence in most of the scenes that adds more mystery to his character. What would you do if Freddy Krueger turned up in your nightmares?
I need you, Jesse. We got special work to do here, you and
The Man of Your Dreams is back. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddys Revenge, 1985. It has been 5 years since the final girl Nancy put an end to Freddy Krueger and his nightmares. The Thompsons had moved out and a new family had moved into their old house. Jesse woke up to a nightmare about a serial killer stalking his victims. When Lisa comes to visit Jesse after school hours, they stumble upon Nancy's diary. On turning the pages, Jesse notices the similarities between their nightmares. After messing around Jesse's house for a while, Krueger finally visits him in a nightmare. But instead of killing Jesse, he wanted to use him as a puppet to kill others. Despite Jesse trying his best not to fall asleep, it doesn't take long before one can tell him apart from Freddy. Jesse's odd behavior concerns his parents, as they assume that either Jesse has completely lost it, or he has been consuming drugs. It wasn't easy for Jesse to be around the people close to him, as Krueger had somehow taken over his body, and at times it would change his physical appearance. As Jessie continues to get scared, Freddy keeps using that fear to get stronger. Since Wes Craven wasn't thrilled with the idea of a sequel to A Nightmare on Elm Street, he didn't return to work on this project. The idea of Freddy killing his victims outside their dreams using Jessie didn't sit well with him either. Wes Craven's Freddy wouldn't have killed people when they weren't asleep. Neither would he have used another person to stalk and kill his victims. Compared to the original, a lot of Freddy's actions don't add up. It doesn't make sense for Freddy to come out of the dream world where he can't access most of his powers. Despite the plot holes, the film was well received in Europe, and over the years it has grown on in others. Initially, New Line Cinema had thought they can continue the story of Freddy Krueger without Robert Englund, as they were reluctant to give him a raise. But once they saw the disastrous result of replacing him with an extra, they changed their minds. Even though Freddy is seen for only 13 minutes on the screen, the actor's portrayal of the slasher villain gives the film an eerie atmosphere. Freddy is just around the corner. A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, 1987. Only a year has passed since Freddy terrorized Jessie, and now he seems to have found a new victim. However, this time Freddy doesn't step out of the dream world and sticks to killing people in their nightmares. Kristen Parker was making a model of the house that Nancy and Jessie had previously occupied. After falling asleep, she finds herself in Elm Street, where Freddy slashes her wrists. Assuming that her daughter is suicidal, Kristen's mother sends her to Western Hills Psychiatric Hospital. There, Kristen meets Nancy Thompson, who had previously defeated Freddy Krueger. It wasn't a good time to be a child in Elm Street, as most of them were now victims of the resurrected serial killer, who could manipulate their dreams. The only ones who hadn't fallen victim to him yet were the children who had enrolled in the psychiatric hospital. Nancy was assigned to the hospital to research dreams, as she was now a grad student. The child psychiatrist Neil Gordon discussed with her the children's reluctance to fall asleep, as they seemed to be suffering from a group delusion. Nancy herself was taking a non-FDA approved drug called Hypnosil to suppress her dreams. When Kristen had another nightmare, Nancy learns of her ability to pull other people into her dreams. Kristen wasn't the only kid in the hospital with special abilities in the dream world. All of them had their unique powers. As the Dream Warriors go after Freddy, they realize they had underestimated their enemy. Each time Freddy killed a new child, he became stronger, and now had control over the souls of his victims. One of the initial ideas was for Freddy to haunt the cast and crew of the film in the real world, but it was rejected by the studio. Instead, we get to know more about Freddy's origin in the movie before he turned into a dream-walking slasher. His gloves, however, were stolen from the film's set, and were next seen hanging on the wall in the Evil Dead sequel. Dream Warriors is a worthy sequel to the original, and it does live up to the expectations. With dialogue like "Welcome to Primetime," Freddy established himself as the killer with a sick sense of humour. The humour doesn't overpower the horror elements, and you do keep hoping for all the children to somehow survive the nightmares. But the slasher we have learned to fear and love wouldn't give up on stalking and killing, even when a group of survivors with special powers gang up against him.
You shouldn't have buried me. I'm not dead.
Are you ready for Freddy? A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, 1988. It has been a year since the Dream Warriors went up against Freddy, but Kristen was afraid that he might return at any moment, and she continues to pull others into her dream. After the events of the last film, the children who survived were no longer confined to a psychiatric facility, and they were back in school. During one of the nightmares, Kristen pulled the others in. Jason, Kincaid's dog, woke her up by biting her in the arm. Later, Jason played a huge part in bringing Freddy back to life. After the kids returned to their normal lives, it didn't take long for Kristen to make new friends. Her new friend Alice had been living a difficult life. Because of how terrible her reality is, Alice often used to daydream as an escape. As soon as Freddy comes back to life, he kills Kincaid. He then goes after the rest of the kids who survived his attacks at the psychiatric hospital. Kristen couldn't help but fall asleep, as her mother had sneaked in sleeping pills into her drink. For a while, she manages to avoid a nightmare by trying to dream of pleasant things. She dreams of a beach where she meets a young Alice building a sandcastle. When Freddy finally appears in her dream, she sacrifices herself to save her friend Alice, and somehow transfers her ability to pull others into a dream. From a supporting character, Alice's role suddenly shifts as the main lead. The franchise takes on a horror comedy route in this one. Although not as effective as the previous installment, we get to see more of Freddy's dark sense of humour. Patricia Arquette didn't return to her role as Kristen in this movie. and although there are certain speculations, no one knows the exact reason for her not reprising the role. Even Wes Craven had refused to rewrite the script and direct the new sequel. It was the highest grossing A Nightmare on Elm Street movie to be released till then. Although Alice had become the main character halfway through the film, she was convincing as the final girl.
It's a boy!
It's a Boy, A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, 1989. A year after the events of The Dream Master, Alice and Dan got together as they returned to their normal lives. But Alice finds herself dreaming about an asylum where she sees a nun named Amanda Krueger. After their graduation ceremony, Alice shares the encounter with Dan, who assures her that she is the one in control of her dreams. Yet Alice ends up having another dream about the asylum, where she sees Amanda give birth to Freddy, who has figured out a way to return. When Dan hears of the incident, he tries to rush to Amanda's aid, but ends up falling asleep on his motorcycle. This leads to a brutal death as Krueger had found a new victim. Amanda faints at the sight of her boyfriend dying, and when she wakes up in the hospital, she learns that she's pregnant. Freddy was now using Alice's unborn child to lure others into the dream world. If you felt that the story was all over the place in this sequel, it's because the script was still being written after the shoot had started. Because of the limited time to develop the story, the ideas were all over the place. Just like most franchises, Nightmare 2 had run out of steam by its 5th part. One of the reasons that add to the failure of this sequel was that Freddy was everywhere after the release of Dream Master, and by now people had gotten a bit tired of seeing him. Even the kills in this movie look more comical than terrifying in comparison to its predecessors. The cast and crew weren't satisfied with the final results, and they weren't surprised when the film wasn't well received. But it was one of the toughest films for Robert Englund, as he had to perform a lot of the stunts. Although he did have a body double, he was required to do the stunts for the scenes where his face was clearly visible. However, the scene where Super Freddy appears, the gigantic version of the slasher, is played by Michael Bailey Smith.
Oh, yeah. Great to be back in business.
You think you know about dreams? Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, 1991. Almost a decade after he haunted Alice and her unborn child, Freddy returns to Springwood to kill all the children and teenagers living in the town. Alice and Jacob were able to escape his nightmares, as both of them have moved out of town. But there were a handful of children remaining who Freddy was yet to kill. One of them was John Doe, who woke up with no memory of who and where he was. John is sent to a shelter for troubled youth, where he meets other children who have lived a tough life. As the only clue about John was a paper clipping from Springwood, his doctor decides that visiting the town might trigger a trip down memory lane. When the children end up at the house Freddy grew up in, they learn that Freddy had a child he was separated from. John mistakes himself as the slasher's offspring, but he ends up dying at the hands of Freddy, who informs him that he had a daughter. It's not long before it's revealed that Dr. Maddie Burrows was born as Catherine Krueger and later given up for adoption. The film goes deep into the history of Freddy Krueger and his tragic life before he is killed off by his daughter. It was intended to be the final Nightmare on Elm Street film, but the sequels that followed tell us that the franchise, as well as Freddy Krueger, had been revived a couple more times. It was the first movie that New Line Cinema released in 3D. Alice Cooper appeared in the film as Freddy's father, because he could play the role without his signature makeup. Alice's child Jacob was the first choice for John Doe, but the character had to be changed as Lisa Wilcox's return couldn't be secured. There were no horror elements left in the intended final Nightmare movie. Even the new characters weren't as memorable as the ones to have appeared in the previous films. In the first part, it was mentioned that Freddy Krueger was a child murderer who was killed by the parents of the victims. But according to the backstory of the final Nightmare, he was murdered by his wife. The backstory was supposed to make us sympathize with Freddy, with the narrative that it was his circumstances that made him a villain. Somehow, the backstory works against the plot and takes away even more elements that made Freddy Krueger an iconic slasher villain. Miss Me? Wes Craven's New Nightmare, 1994. The idea for the script where Freddy comes to haunt the cast and crew of the film was rejected for the 3rd part of the franchise, but Wes Craven picked up the idea for New Nightmare. The film begins with the creation of Freddy's glove, and somehow it comes to life and kills the special effects crew. Heather, the actress who played Nancy in the first movie, was now being stalked by someone who resembled Freddy. The actress had faced issues with a stalker in real life, and Wes Craven took her permission to include the experience in the story. Most of the cast and crew appear as themselves in the film, and even New Line Cinema is shown as they call in Heather for a meeting about a new Final Nightmare movie being made by Wes Craven. She turns down the offer to work in the film as she was stressed out by her new stalker. When her son dies a death similar to the characters of the first Nightmare movie, she asks for Craven's help to understand what's going on. Freddy had manifested himself into the real world, and he saw Heather as an enemy, as her character had killed him in the first movie. After a series of sequels that were more comedy than horror, Freddy Krueger finally returns as the slasher villain everyone should fear. Although the movie didn't perform well at the box office, it's the only Nightmare movie since the original where we see Freddy at his boldest. In New Nightmare, the slasher villain was portrayed the way Wes Craven had imagined he should appear, more sinister than ever. When the film plays, it's difficult to understand whether it's a feature film or a documentary, as there's no opening title. In the closing credits, it says that Freddy Krueger appeared as himself, even though Robert Englund had returned to play the role. Evil will battle evil. Freddy vs. Jason 2003. What could go wrong when two slashers appear together? This is the final movie where Robert Englund played Freddy Krueger. After Jason goes to hell, Freddy manipulates him into killing the teenagers of Springwood to help him regain his strength. Now that Jason was killing the people of Springwood, the police suspect Freddy behind the murders. As Jason continues to kill, Freddy realizes that there will be no victims left for him. Freddy possessed one of the Springwood residents who helped him electrocute Jason, as the two killers fought it off in the dream worlds that Freddy had complete control over. The film failed to live up to the hype, but that's what happens with most awaited crossovers. Freddy vs. Jason had more over-the-top action scenes than horror elements. For a movie where the two iconic slashers go against one another, there seems to be a bias towards Jason's character, as the story revolves around him, and Freddy appears like the antagonist. It's hard to say which of them is more evil. Over 17 scripts were submitted for this film, and all of them were turned into a single one. When Ken Kersinger had to turn up to the dentist's office in Jason's costume, minus the mask, as there wasn't much time to change, people almost called the police thinking he's an escaped psychopath. Though there's not much horror to this crossover, it still makes for an entertaining watch.
Wake up! You're bleeding.
Never Sleep Again, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2010. The 2010 remake is a poor retelling of the original film. Dean Russell falls asleep at a dining table, and in his nightmare he is visited by a burned figure, wearing an outlandish costume who cuts his throat. Meanwhile, it appears as though Dean killed himself by cutting his own throat outside of the dream world. The other teenagers in the town refuse to fall asleep as they are afraid of dying in their sleep. Also, the mystery of how they knew each other in their childhood remains a mystery, as despite having photographic evidence, they don't recall knowing each other. Similar to the incidents of the first film, Chris is killed by the burned man after falling asleep. Jesse is suspected as the murderer and is taken to jail, but he too ends up dying at the hands of Krueger after falling asleep behind the bars. Nancy discovers how all of them were connected, as they all went to the same preschool. Nancy's mother finally opens up about Freddy Krueger, the gardener who did bad things to the children and was arrested shortly after he skipped. Now he's back and tormenting the children he once did wrong. Although the film was a commercial success, the fans, critics, and industry professionals were so disappointed with the way the film was handled that no one called Platinum Dunes for 2 years. The remake was somehow even more disappointing than the stretched out sequels, where the story had lost its steam. There was a lot of scope for retelling the story in a way that the fans of the franchise would respect it, but it doesn't. The only good thing about the movie is Jackie Earle Haley's portrayal of Freddy Krueger. A similar backstory for the villain was scrapped off for the original movie, but the remake decided to go with it. Even Wes Craven was vocal about his displeasure with the remake.
I thought I was up to,
Is there going to be a new Nightmare on Elm Street movie? So far, there's no news of a new Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but Elijah Wood has recently expressed his interest in reviving the horror franchise, on the condition that Robert Englund reprises his role as the iconic slasher. He believes that it's possible for the franchise to take on a new direction, but the foundation has to be laid by the original Freddy Krueger. Although fans would love to see Robert Englund reprise the role one more time, it might be too late for the actor to return, as he's currently 74 years old. He's still active as an actor and wouldn't mind lending his voice if there was an animated remake to the original, or come up with other creative ways to be involved with the project. But playing Freddy on screen can be physically taxing, as the makeup alone takes hours, and he has previously performed a lot of his own stunts as the character. The next time Freddy is revived to haunt nightmares, hopefully we will see the actor reprising the role, even if it's for a brief period. If you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks!